everybody. So we're about to get started. Normally it would be Roland Paris who would be introducing this report and this panel, but who was the director of CIPS. But as many of you know, he left last Friday to join the Prime Minister as a special advisor. So I'll do my best to quickly introduce our report and our panel. My name is Elaine Feldman. I'm the co-chair of this group along with Ailish Campbell, who also until last Friday was planning to be here. She was with the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, but she took a new job as of Monday as an ADM at Finance. So given that it's day 2 on the job, she's not here. But luckily we have Brian Kingston also from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, who has been an integral part of the group preparing the report. To Brian's left is Suzanne Vinet, who many of you will know, long active in trade policy and most recently Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and retired about a year ago. And to her left is John Gero. Again, I think given so many familiar faces, many of you have probably worked for John in the past. And they're going to ask you really tough questions. Former ADM trade policy at what is now Global Affairs Canada, and former ambassador to the WTO. To my right, we have the Honourable Chuck Strahl, who was, again, Member of Parliament for many years, former Minister of Transport, former Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, former Minister of Indian Affairs. I don't know what they called it then. It's gone through so many titles. And we're very lucky that he's here from British Columbia today. And to the right of Chuck is John Weeks, again, a person for whom many of you probably worked in the past. Former now.
Well, that's too long ago now.
Well, I worked for John. Also former ambassador to the WTO, former ambassador to the GATT before that, and negotiated for Canada's negotiator for the NAFTA. So I'm hoping that this will be more of a conversation than a presentation. I hadn't expected, to be honest, that the room would be set up so formally. But Brian and I, who will walk you through very quickly our paper, really hope that this can be an opportunity for questions. So as you may or may not know, our paper is one of 4 papers that Roland had asked a group of people to present. I'm not quite sure how we advance the slides. Is someone doing that for us? So I think we're the last of the 4 reports, one on international security and defense, one on international development, one on human rights, and one on trade and commerce. And so when we sat down as a group to look at how we wanted to proceed and what we wanted to talk about, we decided that it was important that we not look at trade just as an external matter, something that goes across the border. But it was really important, if you're looking at, as we've called this report, Challenges for the 21st Century, very important to look at the domestic agenda as well, because trade is not just far from government actions. It's really about what the private sector does to take advantage of the framework that the government has set. And so we decided that it was important to look at the domestic agenda and what needs doing on the domestic front to put in place that framework that will enable Canadian companies to take advantage of international trends. So as you'll see, as if you read the report, that we've been trying to focus not just on goods, although they remain an important part of the trade agenda, but but services, investment, global value chains, e-commerce, the digital economy, those are all important for trade in the 21st century. And we believe strongly that Canadian firms need to be much more aggressive and more purposeful in the pursuit of new markets. That if there's a limit to what the government can do, and it really is up to business to take advantage of those opportunities. And we're a trading nation. Even if you only look just at goods trade, trade has traditionally accounted for a third of Canadian GDP. So failure to take advantage of these new frameworks could have serious consequences for Canadian prosperity. That said, we think that as a country, we've got a lot of advantages. We're a diversified economy. We've got a rich endowment of natural resources. We are lucky geographically. We happen to be situated next to the world's largest economy, the United States. We have a range of trade agreements which, if, and it is still an if, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with the EU and the Trans-Pacific Partnership go forward, would mean that we would have free trade with more than 60% of the global economy. But I said if because we are still some distance from seeing a final CETA text and some distance from seeing ratification and implementation of the TPP. But so we think that there's a lot that we have going for us, but recent developments mean that we're also vulnerable. Falling commodity prices have eroded the value of our key exports. So while volume may not have changed dramatically, value has declined. Another point, and you'll see it, maybe Brian, we could move to the slide that's the picture.
Sure.
If you look at this, I think it's a really telling slide that large firms are Canada's top exporters, and in Canadian terms, large means more than 500 employees. That small firms, less than 100, account for 1.3% of Canadian companies that export, and medium-sized firms, 19%. But even our large firms barely count as large by international standards. And we are really a country that is still largely comprised of small and medium-sized enterprises, and as you see, not very many of them are exporters. Another point that on which I think we are vulnerable, and maybe you could go to the slide on exposure to emerging market economies. So if you look at this slide, you'll see that even though I think that, we'll all acknowledge that there's been a slowdown in the last couple of years in terms of the growth of some of the emerging markets, they still will account for the bulk of growth in years to come. If you look at the distinction between advanced economies and emerging and developed markets, you'll see that and these figures are a few years old, and they're probably slightly off now, given what we've seen in the course of the last year or two. But emerging and developing markets will amount for a much higher share of global growth than developed economies. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that our exposure to emerging market economies is relatively small compared to many of our other developed country comparators. You'll see that as a share of total exports, we rank the lowest among a group of the UK, Germany, US, Australia, etc. And I think there's a fairly recent Bank of Canada report that said even if we were able to bring our share of exports to emerging market economies to that of the U.S., which is not one of the larger exporters, we could increase our trade by $60 billion a year. So there are lots of things that we think we can do to take advantage of conditions of trade. If you look at the next slide on the numbers of millions of global middle class, you'll see that the greatest rise in terms of the global middle class will be in Asia, largely in China. And although China is our third largest trading partner, we still have a long way to go in terms of taking advantage of the Chinese market. So we have come forward as a result of the thinking that we've been doing about this with 24 recommendations. And I think they just happen to divide out almost equally between what we're calling the international agenda and domestic reforms. And I won't go through them in any great detail because you can read them all for yourself, but I think it's important, given what I've just said, to look at least the first few. So the first one, of course, is modernize the North American trading platform. I said earlier that we are lucky geographically to be next to the world's largest economy, the United States, but we are part of North America. So not just the U.S., but also Mexico. We think there's a lot more that we can do in North America to take advantage of North American competitiveness, but also more that we need to do just in terms of Canada-Mexico. We need to remove the visa that was put in place in 2009. We need to take advantage. There's been if you look at Mexico, you've got a new government, relatively new government, which has moved ahead with a number of trade liberalizing measures. It's got a rapidly growing middle class. It's a young country. The demographics just mean inevitably that in a number of years, Mexico is going to replace Canada as the U.S.'s largest NAFTA trading partner. We like to say that we're the U.S. #1 trading partner. There's some discussion about whether China has overtaken us and whether we're #2 now. An interesting article in yesterday's Globe that says if you look at services trade, not just goods trade, we're still #1. But in any event, in a number of years, we're going to be behind Mexico. And it's something we need to recognize and something we need to take account of as we move forward. And that means taking account of U.S. concerns over border security, which are different vis-a-vis Mexico than they are from Canada. But as I said, we believe that modernizing the North American trading platform is our #1 recommendation. The next couple won't surprise you. Finalize and ratify the Canada-EU agreement, ratify the TPP. #4, we've got as launch bilateral trade talks with China with a view to an eventual free trade agreement with China. The next recommendations include joining the Pacific Alliance, which is the fastest growing economies now in Latin America, concluding bilateral deals with India and Japan. Not as easy as they sound, of course, because we've been trying to negotiate with India for a number of years, and frankly, it's a very difficult exercise. Japan, now that we have a TPP, there may not be much interest on the part of Japan to doing anything further with Canada, but it may be possible to deepen some of the obligations that are in that agreement. We'll have to see. And negotiate closer ties with ASEAN, those members that aren't part of the TPP. Now, it's hard for some of us at this table who spent many years at the WTO to have the WTO recommendation come in at number 7, but but I think most of the people at this table would say that the Doha round is, I'll go right out and say that it's dead. It's not dying, it's not on life support, but the Doha round has been dead for a number of years, and it's time for us to acknowledge that, salvage what we can, and move on. Then you'll see a number of the other recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all, but I think there are some really important ones there, including the integration of trade more closely with development and the maintenance of preferential tariffs, which effectively amount to 0 for the least developed countries. I'm now going to turn it over to Brian, who will speak to the second a set of our recommendations, which focus on the domestic reforms that we think need to go hand in hand with the international agenda that I've just spoken to.
Thank you. So yeah, as Elaine said, the whole premise of this paper is that we can't just focus on international recommendations. We obviously have to have the domestic framework in place to ensure that companies are ready and able to export abroad. So we have a number of recommendations that relate directly to that, so I'll go through them. I won't get too specific because some of the recommendations could be a paper in themselves, but here we go. So the first is modernizing the agreement on internal trade. This is something that many people have written on for years and years, and there have been efforts by the provinces to modernize the AIT, and they've actually committed to doing so by March 2016. We'll see where that goes, but relating to Elaine's point about the need to have more large companies that can export, you can't have large companies if you have a fragmented domestic market, and that's the situation we're in right now in Canada. So we recommend just a few points here. I won't go through everything that should be done, but at a very minimum, the AIT should be as ambitious as the CETA agreement. CETA was amazing because it brought the provinces to the table, and we actually got agreements on sub-federal procurement. So we think that should be a baseline for the AIT, and provinces are working to implement those changes. We think that the concept of mutual recognition, it's a pretty simple concept, but that should apply to all the provinces and territories. And then finally, and this one I think is really important, is around the governance structure of the AIT. Right now, we have a rotating chair. Every time you get a province that's the chair and they have a very engaged chair, they rotate out after a year. So even if they have a very aggressive agenda, after a year, it's really hard to implement serious changes. So we think there's real structural changes that need to happen to the actual governance model of the AIT to help create a true free trade market within Canada. Secondly, we should remove all barriers that hinder Canadian suppliers from being globally competitive. A couple of issues here that you won't be surprised with, supply management, of course, being the first. We think that there's a lot of potential for Canadian dairy and poultry exporters, and they're not accessing global markets right now because of the system we have in place, so we think some time should be spent examining how we can change that. We think that there's more that can be done to help SMEs export. Canada has one of the lowest de minimis rates in the OECD right now. So we think raising the de minimis would help small and medium importers and exporters access products. Right now we're at $20, the US is $200. So that seems to me to be a simple change that would make a big difference. And then lastly, I think there's potential for Canada to do more in terms of unilateral tariff liberalization. We've looked at this issue, and Dan Churiak, the former deputy chief economist at Foreign Affairs and Trade, did a study for us, and he found that eliminating tariffs across the board would generate about $20 billion a year in annual economic activity. I know it's a bit of an ambitious thing to do, but we do think there's some serious merit to looking at Canada's remaining tariff structure and deciding what really needs to remain there. The third recommendation is around clarifying, I'm going off just the domestic. It would be the third, but in your booklet it's a different number. Clarifying Canada's foreign investment regime. So as I'm sure many of you know, there was the Wilson panel that looked at elements of the Investment Canada Act. Some of that has been implemented, other elements have not. So we think there's still some way to go there, particularly around state-owned enterprises. The government's position on SOE investment has been rather unclear, and it's a deterrent to investment in Canada. Improving trade and investment statistics, we think, is a really important piece of this whole analysis. As we did our research, you'll find that looking at foreign affiliate stats and services statistics, they're actually not extremely detailed. It's hard to break out foreign affiliate trade stats by country, and of course there's a delay in getting the statistics. Now, I recognize this isn't an easy thing to do, and there are privacy concerns around some foreign affiliate stats, but we think it's really important to have the data to help us guide our trade policy positions. Implementing a national food traceability system. Canada obviously has one of the best agricultural sectors in the world, and we think there's a lot of potential to market Canada's sector by having a more traceable system and basically marketing our products as kind of best in class. Now, I recognize that, of course, traceability is very expensive, and there are experts amongst our group who can comment on that. So there needs to be a balance, of course, between the cost of doing this, but we think there are some real benefits to moving ahead with that. Strengthening consultations with stakeholders in trade negotiations. Again, there's many trade experts here that will have a lot of experience with this, but we do think there needs to be a new system to strengthen the consultation mechanism. I've actually just come from a couple of TPP rounds myself, and Canada's negotiators are extremely open and frank with stakeholders. That's not a problem, but there's not a huge representation of Canadian business when you compare it to other countries. For example, the Americans send what appears to be a whole 747 of stakeholders to every round, and there's really intense engagement with those stakeholders at these rounds. So there needs to be some thinking about how we engage stakeholders more substantively at these negotiations. Another part of this, of course, is also promoting our trade deals. As I'm sure you've all seen recently, there's been debate around TPP-IP rules, and a lot of the debate hasn't been founded in fact or reality. So I think there needs to be better communication of what's in these trade deals to the general public so everyone understands. Next recommendation, I won't go into detail, has to do with utilizing economic diplomacy. The government's already launched the Global Markets Action Plan, so they're working on this. We believe that you need to identify tools to drive trade and investment and expand infrastructure and a national energy strategy. So this is a bit of a catch-all, but I'll just note a couple of things here. According to the World Economic Forum, their global competitiveness report, we do tend to lag in infrastructure. Now, the government has obviously announced new infrastructure investments, but we think that they really need to focus on productivity-enhancing trade infrastructure. So things like ports and airports would be absolutely critical. We're also one of the most expensive places in the world to fly from. So I think we rank 130th in air ticket and taxes. So that's another area. If we want to be a global production hub, particularly for services trade, we need to find a way to address that issue. On the national energy strategy, again, that's another topic you could write a whole paper on. The provinces did announce some progress on this, but we've yet to come up with a truly comprehensive and harmonized approach to energy in Canada. So I think there's some serious merit to doing that. The next two recommendations have to do with immigration. So number 9 is enhancing or examining Canada's immigration policies to ensure we attract and retain talent. And 10 is introducing a new visa category for immigrants who anchor global business in Canada. Being someone who works for companies that are global, we continually hear from our members, almost daily, frankly, that there are issues getting talent into Canada on a very short-term basis. So even if just coming in from the U.S. To attend a conference or do a couple of days of work, it's always a challenge. So I think there's merit in some sort of a multiple entry visa for high-skilled workers. And the last recommendation, I don't think it gets enough attention, but we believe that there needs to be adequate resources provided to Canada's trade remedy system. Trade remedies continue to be important to the global trade system and to Canada. They don't often get much attention, but we think that there needs to be the adequate resources provided there. As you know, in the Economic Action Plan in 2012, there was a move to consolidate the trade remedy investigation functions into one organization. So we need to make sure that that's working, and if not, look at ways to make sure it's effective. So that's it in a nutshell. I know that I've covered a lot of ground in less than 5 minutes, but we'd be happy to go into specifics on any of these and have a bit of a discussion.